All right, it might seem like an obvious question. Where do people buy games from? Where are games sold? Well, the truth is it's actually a really important question because it's changed a lot in the last few years, and it's important to recognize that really the stakes have changed in how games get sold. So historically, retail, right? So brick and mortar kinds of places, right? Like Target or Best Buy or maybe your favorite corner game store, right? Those were critically important for game developers for many years, right? That retail is where games were sold forever. And it's actually had a major impact on the kinds of games that get sold, right? Because certain stores, like take Walmart here in the United States, for example, cares about the kinds of content that get put in front of people, and so they actually had a stake in the kinds of games that were getting made. Increasingly, retail is a complicated space, right? You had to worry about things like store shelf space, right? This hurt games like Guitar Hero or Rock Band, right? Because they came in these giant boxes, and places like Best Buy were used to things like this big on a shelf, and they could stack lots of them together. And so that was different, right? Store shelf space mattered. You have things like shelf life, right? Nobody really wants to leave a game on the shelf forever, right? They cycle off the shelf. You can't have everything there, right? That's the difference between, maybe your local game store and the big box store. And so those games cycled off, and the amount of time that a game spent on the shelf was really important, right? How many of you have ever shopped in the game bargain bin? The bargain bin exists precisely because games fall off the shelf. And so as a developer, you had to worry about those things. And so one of the things that this resulted in is that game developers and game publishers had to really generate a lot of demand before a game ever shipped, right? Because the moment it hit that shelf, suddenly its time was limited, and it had to sell off that shelf really quickly. And so you had to coordinate, right, this rollout. And if you missed your ship date, that was horrendous, right? Especially if you're talking about really big games, and maybe you're going to hit right about, right before Thanksgiving, so that you're there for, here in the United States, like maybe Christmas or, the winter holidays, right? Those were important times. And if a developer missed their date, it could kill a product. That started to change a little bit, right? So in here, you can kind of think about, well, okay, so a game costs $60 at retail. Let's pay attention to the money that gets subtracted from that, right? So a customer pays their money, the retailer takes that, right? But there's a difference between how much the retailer paid for something and how much they got it from the distributor. The distributor takes some of that money, and then there's a difference between what they paid for the product and what the manufacturer paid for it, and what the publisher is expecting, right? And so money sort of disappears all over the place in that model, right? Which is why, I'm going to talk about it just in a second, right? Digital distribution became so popular so rapidly amongst game developers because it sort of changed this equation, right? And ultimately, the developer saw not that much of that money. And what happens when you talk about used game sales and all sorts of other things like that, right? Following the money is really important. So let's talk about those brick and mortar stores, particularly our chain stores, things like Best Buy, Walmart, GameStop. Oftentimes they have a direct relationship with publishers, right? Which is oftentimes why people partner with them, right? It's those relationships with the brick and mortar stores that make retail space possible. And so you can't just go to your local Walmart and say, hey, I've got this game, I'd like to put it on your shelf. They're not going to know what to do with that. And so that relationship exists because the goal is to move product, to pay for the fact that those things are on the shelf, right? The retailer has to pay for their lights and electricity, right? And so every space on the shelf matters to them. And they honestly prefer large publishers because those games are the games that are going to sell, and that's going to be what helps pay for their shelf space, right? And so your big games are the ones that go to the chain stores. And the challenge of the independent publisher becomes that really in that space you only get a few titles a year that are going to make you the majority of your money, right? And you have this limited budget for marketing, and right, and if your game is too risky, right, a retailer won't carry it because they're worried that there's not a chance to get money back. And if you can't get it on the shelf and have it move off the shelf, you're not going to get any money either. And so what happens is that's one of the reasons why you see the same kinds of games every year, right? Or you see franchises, because that's how publishers and retail stores manage risk, right? They're interested in ensuring that they're able to pay their employees and make profits as well. So let's talk about rentals and resale here for a second, because I think this is a really important thing to keep in mind. So some publishers create a rental version of a game, right, which is sold differently, because renting a game is quite different than selling a game. And reselling a game is different than buying it in the first place. So something like GameStop, right? If you have a local game store that sells used games, the truth is that developers don't see any money off of that, right? Unless the game somehow asks people to buy downloadable content, right? That's where that comes from. And so it's important for you to think about, right? If you want to be a game developer and you want to make money off your games, well, how do you deal with used games? Because, as I said, you're not going to see any money from that. And what does rental mean for you anyway, right? Some games that works, right? Maybe it's a subscription model, so you didn't really actually need to make that money in the first place. And so this has been a real contentious thing, because in something like film, right, movies were licensed differently, and so when you rented a movie, that was different. Or if you, but it doesn't get rid of that secondary market either, or the fact that you can go to a library and take out a DVD on loan, right? Which is why you see things like interactive content or restrictions on increasingly new formats of video too. So more recently, digital distribution has become one of the biggest areas of game sales, right? And it's complicated, right? So you have certain channels on platforms. What do I mean by that? Well, on the Xbox 360, on the Xbox One, on your PlayStation 3, your PlayStation 4, any of these things, or the Wii or WiiWare, right? Those are the channels through which games get sold on those platforms, right? So each one has their own. So maybe you have Xbox Live Arcade, you have the PlayStation Network, WiiWare, right? And so suddenly the platform acts like a digital distribution platform, in addition to being this thing that you can go buy games at a brick and mortar store, right? Becomes able to download games or buy games directly over the network. Again, here, right, there's lower barrier to entry in terms of, like, it's not quite the same as trying to get your game in a brick and mortar store, but you still have a lot of barriers to entry, right? And increasingly, it's getting easier and easier for independent developers or people like you to make it onto these networks. It's still not trivial, though, because you do have to deal with sort of the technological part of this, right? Dev kits, right? So that's still complicated. But you also have things like Steam, right? Which is a digital distribution platform for PC, Mac, and Linux. And Valve serves as the publisher and the distributor of those games, right? And so each game developer is offered a unique contract and a revenue split for their game. And you could probably even do this now too, because Valve has their green light system, right? If you can get enough people to say, hey, this game looks pretty cool, you might be able to get your game greenlit. It's how you can wind up on that digital distribution platform. Digital distribution removes the retailer, right? It removes that brick and mortar store, but it doesn't really change the relationship that you're going to have with that publisher. So you also have things like iOS, right? And it's possible for things like the App Store, right? So Google Play or Apple's iOS App Store, right? Where you're actually removing the retailer and the publisher altogether, right? And so, as I said, it was popularized by Apple in the iOS App Store, and the typical revenue splits are something like 70% of the money goes to you, the developer, and 30% to someone like Apple or Google for the service of running that network, of having those libraries, of making that storefront. But it becomes really complicated because what does marketing look like? Apple's not going to do anything to market you. They might feature your game, but that's a different kind of thing. So you also have these things happening now on other platforms, right? So the Amazon App Store, right? You have the Microsoft Windows Store, right? You have app stores on your computer, right? So A lot of this was really sort of pioneered in the game industry, but Apple sort of blew off the doors of getting rid of the fact that you might need a publisher. So you also have the idea of being able to sell your game off your own website, right? People can buy and sell directly through your website if you want to, right? Something like Minecraft. That's where that game got started, right? They made it very easy to buy a game, buy the version of the game off the website, and they made it cheaper earlier on in the development cycle. And the longer the game got worked on, the price went up and up, and so it sort of incentivized people to buy early. You also have things like Congregate, right? That's one of the reasons why we've partnered with them, because you can make revenue off ads, you can have in-app purchases, right? And some of what you're also doing there is just building an audience. And so those are really important things. Digital distribution has also sort of changed the face of marketing for games, because previously it was the enthusiast press, print marketing, all these other places where you had to get attention. And increasingly things like social media, so Twitter, Facebook, are perhaps even more important, or at least just as important as traditional marketing methods. How many of you have actually seen a Clash of Clans ad on TV? The first time I saw that, it was pretty strange for me, because I wasn't accustomed to something like that. But social marketing is just as important. You also have models like subscription models. Think about your favorite massively multiplayer online world. So maybe like World of Warcraft, or maybe you're an EVE online player, right? Or maybe you have a kid who played or plays Club Penguin, right? These are games that have subscriptions, right? You pay a monthly fee to keep playing a game. That's a model that you can think about. You also have things like subscription services, right? So, though it's now closed, an example of this was OnLive, which was a game services platform that allowed you to play a wide variety of games just by subscribing to their system. Right? So you'd pay your monthly fee and you could play any game on the system. Okay, with that, I'll be back and we'll talk about some other ways to make money in games. See you next time.